done your meta-analysis, you're going to see that each study has a particular weight. And the studies may have very little weight or they may have a lot of weight. And you will have classified each of the individual studies as a high risk of bias study and a low risk of bias studies. And you're now going to add up the weight of the high risk of bias studies, and you're going to add up the weight of the low risk of bias studies. And you are now going to ask yourself, do the high risk of bias studies dominate this meta-analysis for this particular outcome? And if they dominate, you're going to be rating down for risk of bias. So we now need to make a threshold and say, how much weight do the high risk of bias studies have to have because before we're going to conclude that the evidence is dominated by these high risk of bias studies? Well, it's somewhat arbitrary, and so it's really ultimately your judgment as to whether or not you're going to consider the evidence dominated by the high risk of bias studies, but we suggest an initial threshold of 65%. In other words, 65% of more of the weight from the high risk of bias studies, you're going to rate down for that outcome. You're going to rate down for risk of bias because the evidence is dominated by the high risk of bias studies. But that 65% is arbitrary, and you may want to be stricter. And we open the possibility of being stricter and choose a lower threshold. And that lower threshold that we suggest is 55%. In other words, 56% or more of the weight from the high risk of bias studies, you're going to consider the evidence dominated by the high risk of bias studies and rate down. And it's really pretty arbitrary. You have to decide yourselves. There's no particular guidance that we have. Do you want to be stricter and choose a threshold of 55% or not quite so strict and choose a threshold of 65%? Up to you. And even these 55 and 65% are somewhat arbitrary. In a particular consideration, you may think for yourself that you want to choose a different threshold. So, bottom line, weight of the high risk of bias studies greater than 65%, you are going to say these evidence is dominated by the high risk of bias studies, and you're going to rate down, although you may use an even stricter threshold of 55%. But if you're over those thresholds, whatever threshold you choose, you're now going to rate down the body of the evidence for that particular outcome for risk of bias because the evidence is dominated by high risk of bias studies. There is one exception. There's one exception that you have. It's dominated by the high risk of bias studies, but you're still not going to rate down. But we're going to deal with that in another little video.